Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
This wasn't a speech about a British exit. This was, in Michael Gove's own words, a speech about the democratic liberation of a whole continent. Today, the Justice Secretary answered his critics on the Remain side, who had defied him to find a vision of what this country would look like outside of the EU. Michael Gove argued that Britain would remain in the free trade zone, like Bosnia, like Serbia, like Albania, he said, but outside of the single market. It would not, he insisted, be governed by its rules or by the European Court of Justice. Crucially, he argued, it would save UK billions in the form of ever-rising costs. Does it sound doable or too good to be true? We'll talk to the former head of the World Trade Organization and a supporter of Brexit in a moment. First, here's Chris Cook.
Today, Michael Gove revealed elements of his case for Brexit and threw scorn on the campaign for Remain.
If we vote to stay, we're not settling for the status quo. We're voting to be a hostage, locked in the boot of a car, driven by others to a place and at a pace that we have no control over. In stark contrast, if we vote to leave, we take back control.
One thing the Justice Secretary set out was how post-Brexit Britain would relate to the European Union. So, to pick one example, what would his plan mean for one of our most delicious industries, cheese? So, because we're EU members who follow all the rules and regulations and we don't give too much subsidy to our farmers are allowed to sell, for example, their cheese across the EU without facing any tariffs or non-tariff barriers. But what would happen if we left? Imagine you're a farmer trying to sell, for example, this Stilton. So, if we got a deal like Switzerland has, not much would change. We'd follow roughly the same rules and regulations, and you'd also be able to sell your cheese across Europe without facing any tariffs. If, however, we went to the other extreme and we got rid of all of the rules and regulations and perhaps we upped the subsidies, we might face a different regime. Farmers might have to fill in forms showing how healthy their cattle were. Farmers might have to apply for import licenses, and for a block of cheese of roughly this size, they'd face tariffs of between 25 and 50 pence, depending on how much cheese other people had already sold to the EU. Mr Gove's plan is for neither of those extremes, but a bespoke deal. He says we can argue to get rid of the red tape and get good EU market access.
There is a free trade zone stretching from Iceland to Turkey that all European nations have access to, regardless of whether they are in or out of the Euro or EU. After we vote to leave, we'll remain in this zone. This suggestion that Bosnia, Serbia, Albania and the Ukraine would remain part of this free trade area and Britain would be on the outside with just Belarus is as credible as Jean-Claude Juncker joining UKIP.
The Remain campaign has teased what they've called the Albanian model and argue none of those countries actually has the deal Mr Gove wants.
It's absurd to suggest that our EU partners, were we to leave, would give us a deal that they don't have themselves. So they would give us full free access to the single market, which they currently pay into to be members of, with us not having paid a fee. Why would they do a deal for us that they as members of the European Union haven't done for themselves?
If we were to become a more deregulated state though, we would probably face some trade barriers compared to what we face at the moment, whether they are tariffs or non-tariff barriers.
Well, we shouldn't do, because of course those European firms sell us £68 billion more in goods and services than we sell them. So there's a mutual self-interest in staying strong trading partners, but an even stronger interest for those German, French, Italian, Spanish exporters not to see trade barriers go up. That's why I think, frankly, some of the scaremongering coming from the Remain campaign doesn't stand up to serious scrutiny.
Now, one other question that Mr Gove answered today is what sort of Britain would he like to have post-Brexit? And the answer was a free trading, buccaneering nation. Yes, he said he'd still like to subsidise farmers, but he also wanted to cut tariffs, cut subsidies and cut red tape. This expert is from a think tank close to the Prime Minister's thinking.
There were some mixed messages in terms of opening up in Michael Gove's speech. On the one hand, he talked about signing free trade agreements with emerging markets. On the other hand, he talked about still protecting farmers. So it's not clear exactly how open they're going to be. And if they're not willing to take on the farming lobby and the vested interest there, you have to ask if they're going to take on the car industry, if they're going to take on social employment law and the trade unions, and how much they're really willing to open up and deregulate.
So would you be comfortable in a world where we dropped tariffs for steel and for cars as part of us rebalancing to a new model of economy?
You've certainly got to look very sensitively at all the different sectors involved, but overall, big picture, I think that if we stay strong trading partners with the EU, but from outside the political club, freed up to trade more energetically from Latin America to Asia, it'll be better for jobs, sustainable jobs, the jobs of the future.
Today's speech was certainly bold and contentious, setting out a plan for a liberal, tariff-light trading state. But the heat for now is around Mr. Gove's belief that we can cut red tape, hold EU market access and cut deals with the rest of the world. A disputed claim, to say the least.
Chris Cook there. So how would this new trade deal for the UK be put into practice? I asked Pascal Lamy, former head of the World Trade Organization, who spent hours on these kinds of negotiations, what he made of the Gove vision.
If you are part of the European Union, you belong to the European single market, which means that you have free access to the whole of the 500 million consumers, plus countries outside Europe for which the European Union has negotiated privileged access for the price of they getting free access to this big market. So if you're in, that's the privileges you have. If you're out, you lose these privileges. You lose your preferred access to the European market, which is roughly 50% of UK trade, and you lose the privileged access to Canada, Mexico, and a series of other countries, which is probably 15% more of UK trade. So you lose the privileged access you have, the free trade you have, for 65% of your exports. You export less, you produce less, you have less trade, less export, less jobs.
But that's the history, if you like. Just because a deal is unprecedented doesn't mean it's not possible. The UK could still trade with the European states free of tariff and non-tariff barriers, but without committing to those full set of rules, couldn't it?
That's a world of trade, if I may, which is paradise, where you get free access free. But we all know that in the world of trade, yesterday, today, tomorrow, you don't get free access free. You get free access for a price, which is I give you access to my market, you give me access to your market. I'm not going to give you access to my market if you don't give me access to your market. This is something that will never work. You know, it's pie in the sky. Trade negotiations are tough, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why they are sometimes so long. It's I give you, you give me. Now, what would the UK have to give to the 27 other Europeans in the case of Brexit, or to Mexico, Canada, Japan, or India? UK would give some access, assuming it reduces its existing market access, would give some access to a 50, 60 million consumers market. You don't get for 60 million consumer market what you get for 500.
So you are saying bluntly, no free trade without following EU trading rules. Does that also mean that we would have to be covered by the European Court of Justice?
You know, I mean, we have precedents. We have a European economic space with countries like Norway, like Liechtenstein, sorry to mention that, like Switzerland, but this is not free of charge. They pay. And that's something that you cannot hide to the British public, the notion that you can exit and keep the benefits that you have while you're in trade-wise, and I'm limiting my my comments to trade, which is the part I know, is just pie in the sky.
Would you go so far as the French economy minister, Emmanuel Macron, did at the weekend to say Britain would be completely killed in trade talks if the country chose to leave?
I think any serious people knowing what's happening in trade on this planet today knows that UK has a formidable asset for the moment, which has benefited a lot to its economies, and that losing this asset would have a price. The notion that you exit the EU trade-wise at no price is simply a lie.
Pascal Lamy, thank you very much.
I've been